In the Ming Dynasty manual Dan Dao Fa Juan, we find techniques for the long sword or the long saber. Now, they could be used for the extremely long saber like this one. This is the Imperial Guard sword from LK Chen. Or you can use a shorter sword. This one is the Crossbowman's Dao, also by LK Chen. This works exactly for this technique. You can use a Miao Dao, or you can even use a katana to practice these techniques. But there's a very interesting and very specific section that mentions techniques that are to be used against a trident. So back in the Ming Dynasty, it was very common for tridents to be used in warfare, and they were infamous for breaking swords, especially two-handed swords. So they could catch, twist, disarm, or just in contact with the rigid edges, they could break or damage the edge of the blade. So as an explanation of what to do when you come up against somebody with a trident, is simply turn the sword around. So in this video, we're going to focus on a couple of these techniques that can be used utilizing the spine of the sword as more of a impact weapon than a cutting weapon. Now, of course, there's really not much detail in the original manual other than it is said to simply turn the blade around and use the spine of the sword. So we're going to use some techniques that are very common with long weapons in Chinese martial arts. And of course, we're going to be doing some striking and some stabbing. So grab your sword, be safe, and let's get to work. Now, before we go any further, I do want to mention quickly that we can use some techniques with the sword in the correct or traditional grip, so with the blade edge forward. I can use the spine of the blade in hoisting techniques and pulling techniques, whether it be high or low, but it more or less limits me to those techniques. So really, in this very specific and special context, we're going to do this by flipping the blade over so that the edge is towards us. Now, of course, that poses a risk, but this is something where if we do crash into a trident, we have the potential of breaking our own blade, and that has a lot more consequences than simply having a blade edge towards us in techniques that we are familiar with. So now, let's do some techniques. Now with the blade flipped, we can start with our first technique. Our first technique is going to be a hammering technique, and this is very common for any kind of sword style when we're using the two-handed sword. We're going to be doing a downward hammering cut. This is a big one, so we want to have a lot of room here. We're smashing down on the opponent. We're trying to crash into their head or their neck or the collarbone. Because this is a blunt object, we're not worrying so much about the cut as we're doing the true physical damage on this one. So as I'm coming down, I'm trying to strike to my opponent's head, or if they have their hands on the weapon, I'm going to try to strike their hands and knock the weapon out of their hands. I can now use this as well to strike the weapon itself safely from my sword and do some damage to theirs. So I'm going to lead with my backhand, pulling and pushing with that front hand to hammer down. Now, if you have an extremely long and somewhat heavy sword like this, you don't want to focus your energy downward. You want to still think of this as striking forward. So this is very similar to staff. So as I'm pulling, my pulling hand comes down, but my pushing hand presses forward. So here, even though the appearance looks like I'm smashing downward, I'm really trying to just strike forward and into my opponent as much as possible. Okay. Now we can also use this in a diagonal downward strike. Okay, so we follow downward here. This is much better for striking towards the neck, the shoulder, the collarbone, that area. And it follows that same principle. So I'm pulling down into my side, pressing forward, and then striking and trying to follow through. Now, naturally, you may get some draw just because as my hand comes back, my distance goes back with both hands. Okay, so again, we have two very, very strong strikes right there. But now we also have an opportunity with the shape of the blade. We can kind of work a little bit around the sides, and we can do more of what I like to call snapping techniques. But these are leverage techniques that have a fulcrum, and we're going to move with that. So the first one we're going to look at is diving technique. So essentially, my front hand is kind of the fulcrum here. My back hand is going to come up, so the tip comes down. Now at the same time, I'm going to reach in and forward so that this ends up going over my opponent's weapon or guard. So if the weapon is in the way here, I come up, and now I can come up and over and strike with the tip of the blade. Now I can also use this to move their weapon down or out of the way as I'm striking. It's deflecting theirs and attacking in and forward. The main thing is, after I do this, both arms reach, so I have a little bit of a thrust at the end. So now we have kind of a particular strike and thrusting technique. We're going to be piercing with the tip of the sword. So again, if my opponent has their weapon up, I'm going to tap it out of the way and I have a chance to pierce and follow up. Now using the same principle, we're going to do it horizontally. And this is going to be a tap to the head. This moves fast because of this snapping motion. My hand is pulling back, the other one is extending. We're moving in opposite directions. And it's going to end up being a nice percussive strike to the head. And if we're lucky, we might even get to pierce with this. So again, we're coming up and hitting. I prefer to be a little bit further up, so we're striking, because if the opponent moves just a little bit, we could end up completely missing. But this is, again, a nice way to quickly hit our opponent from just a quick standing position. We're able to land that strike. Now, of course, this leads into one more technique, and this is going to be our forward thrust. So this is just like using a staff or a spear. We're going to take that front end, thrust forward, and poke. Now, again, if we're finding ourselves up against the trident, we have that consequence that maybe they're going to crash down on top of the sword, which could end up damaging the blade edge. So we can modify our thrust. If they're completely open, this is an excellent way to thrust. But if we're worried about the weapon, we turn our palms so we have one palm up, one palm down, and then now the sword is sideways to thrust. The nice thing about this is we can find ourselves slipping in between their armor or their protection to move up to vulnerable points, under the arms, under the chin, and so on. So we have our forward thrust, we have our sideways thrust, we have our smashing down technique, straight down or to the angle. We have our diving technique, coming up over the top, or our quick snap horizontally. Again, I want to emphasize that these are techniques that are solely used against fighting somebody with a trident. So this isn't going to be your go-to stance. It's not going to be your go-to techniques. I wouldn't even consider this as something when you want to be non-lethal with a sword. You have a sword and you have many more opportunities to use it if you use it with the blade edge forward. But these are for specific and very special circumstances on the battlefield. So take the time, practice with this. Is really interesting, and it should develop your sword play as well, because you have different weight dynamics when you're moving the sword like this, and you have an understanding of how energy transfers in motion. Even when we're not hitting an opponent, learning how to control it. Like when I was saying that push forward rather than to strike completely downward, that puts a lot of pressure on your elbows. You can help emphasize the downward by sinking into that strike. You see that I was often kneeling down using a kneeling stance. But for the most part, if you're going to be using these strikes, think of more of that press forward. Again, this is very, very specific for when you're fighting one of those guys. So keep that in mind. And if you have any questions or you want to add any input from your own martial arts training or discovery, go ahead and drop that down in the comments below. Again, this is the LK Chen Imperial Guard's Chang Dao, which is the Imperial Guard's long saber. And behind me, you can use something like this as well. This is the crossbowman's Dao, or you can use a katana or a Miao Dao. So I will leave links to these swords down below in the description. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy this video, and I'll see you in the next.